Welcome to Joshua Space, a podcast where I talk about all things books. I have the absolute pleasure of welcoming onto my first episode debut novelist Melissa Fu, who is the author of Peach Blossom Spring. Thank you so much, Melissa, for joining me this morning.
Thank you, Joshua. I'm thrilled to be here and even more thrilled to be your first guest.
I have the absolute pleasure. It's all mine because this book means so much to me. This is has been such an amazing experience reading this book and learning so much about the rich history that China has and things that I didn't realize took place in history. So it led me onto a path where I just kind of started to do a lot more research and look into the history and find other books that are similar. And this book is just so amazing. And the book is Peach Blossom Spring. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what the book is about?
Sure, and that's amazing to hear that it's been like a gateway drug for more books about China, because I think China is so complex and so complicated, and in particular this part of China's history is something that I wanted to shine a light on. So, Peach Blossom Spring is a piece of historical fiction. It starts off in China in 1938 during the Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese invasion of China. We follow a young mother called Mei Lin and her son Renshu, who is about 4 years old, and they are fleeing their burning city. They go through almost a decade of displacement and strife due to first the Sino-Japanese War and then the Chinese Civil War. And they end up fleeing war-torn China at the end of the Chinese Civil War for Taiwan. The son, Renshu, after a bit of stability and education in Taiwan, manages to emigrate to America as a graduate student. And that's where he marries an American woman and has a family and a daughter called Lily. So it's about a lot of things. The book spans nearly 70 years. But I'd say one of the biggest questions, or an overarching question, is how do you rebuild a sense of family, home, and belonging when those things have been shattered by upheaval such as war?
Yeah, I think that's something that's very strong throughout the book because especially when they're on the move and they're not able to call a building their house, their home is essentially wherever they are. They are their home. And I think that was beautifully represented throughout the timeline that they go through. I was in a meeting with you recently, and I found out that the title of the book was originally Henry Dreams an Orchard, and it was going to be a short story. And how did you come from creating the short story that took place in America that was at the end of the Peach Blossom Spring novel, and then going all the way back 70 years and recreating an entire story and timeline? What made you decide to go that far back?
There was a part of me that sort of, as I was going back, couldn't believe there was a part of me saying, are you really going to go this far back? So as you mentioned, the kernel of the book was a short story, which turns out, kind of the main part of it in the end of the novel. And I wanted to do justice to that short story. And I just felt like, well, we have to understand this character, Henry. And so where do you start when you want to understand someone? And I guess for me, because Henry was based loosely on my father's life, while the book is fictional, there are a lot of parallels with real life. And I think for me, he was somebody I could say I never really understood, maybe until I started working on this book, which was 2018, and I was at that point maybe 40. How old was I? 46, I think. 45, 46. So I mean, he was my dad, and there was just a big blank if we thought about, well, who was he before he was our father? And so I thought, what made him the way he is? And I just realized I had to keep going back and keep going back. And then I thought, well, maybe if I understood where he came from. And where he came from, all I knew was China. And all I knew is that China was in a lot of turmoil. And he lived through those two wars like our characters do. So that's, I think, what made me decide. That's what gave me enough of an understanding of who he was as a person. And I could then
Yeah.
fictionalize that into a family and the characters, because I didn't have much of his story, so I needed a story. And that's where I then felt rooted when I started that far back.
Were you ever able to get some of your father's story and what he went through at all?
Just a little bit. So, I mean, growing up, he would tell us zero, mostly just forget about it. It's sad. I don't want to talk about it. I forgot.
Yeah.
But then at one point in my 20s, he told me and my eldest brother a little bit about their family's journey. And it mostly was a kind of an itinerary of, well, first we were in this city, and then the Japanese came. So then we were in this city, and then the Japanese made trouble again. And then we stayed with cousins here. And so I had kind of a dates, time, cities and dates. And then a handful of kind of funny anecdotes about when he came to the US and sort of some of, misunderstandings. He only told the funny stories.
Yeah.
I took the opportunity in the novel to complicate his experience in the US. And I told the not so funny stories about being an immigrant in the US, which I think were things that he never would acknowledge, even would verbally acknowledge, even if they did happen. So
Yeah, and I think we see that with Henry because he very much compartmentalizes a lot of what he went through, and he doesn't talk about it. He doesn't even talk about it with his wife, especially when Lily asks him questions. And I think that was interesting. And I know it's a little bit personal with your father, how he didn't open up until you were in your 20s. And I think that's interesting because in the book, Henry doesn't really open up until to Lily until she's in her 20s. And so did that have a direct parallel that you decided you wanted her to be a certain age when he opened up because of your experience, or did it just kind of naturally happen that way in the story?
that is a great question. I mean, it seems now that I look at it, it seems, oh, well, there's this obvious parallel that she's in her 20s and I was in my 20s. But when I first drafted the book and then in the manuscript we sold, a lot of that opening up by Henry didn't happen until much, much later in the story. I think for reasons of plot and character development, the character of Lily grew a lot in the structural edits. And so she got more time on the page. She became a little bit richer. And that's maybe why those stories ended up in that part of her life. I think originally I had her realizing much of kind of making a connection with him more as an adult when she had children. And I think there were even her children in the story. There were kind of 5 generations when I started, and we chopped off the oldest and the youngest generations and just kept it to 3. So for streamlining purposes, we put that later. But actually, I think for narrative purposes in the end, for streamlining purposes, Lily does understand, makes this connection with her father in her 20s. But I think that actually makes it a better story that gives her more of a chance in a way.
Yeah. And I think the timing with when he opens up was just beautiful in that moment because they're able to take the trip together and they're able to talk a lot. I know that's a little bit of a spoiler, so I'm not going to give away what happens in that scene other than he does open up. And I think that was just beautiful the way it happens. And so I noticed you said how there was originally going to be 5 generations.
Yeah.
You had the oldest dating back further, and then the youngest even further in the future. Is that something you'd ever consider writing or making like a novella, not necessarily another novel, but just like a short story or a novella or something to kind of continue the story going?
I hadn't thought about that. What a good idea. Yeah. There are various bits that we needed to take out to streamline. And I thought they could be standalone short stories, but yeah, watch this space. maybe, yeah.
I'm definitely rooting for that to happen. So I'd love to hear more about their stories because I love the way your style of writing and the way you write these stories and you bring these characters to life. It's really just amazing the way you're able to do that.
Oh, thank you.
One of the other things that I was noticing too is because there is a lot of history And I know you didn't necessarily grow up through those times. And so it's not a firsthand experience. What kind of research did you have to do to be able to understand what was going on and write about it and not go down just the rabbit hole of wanting to do more research and then kind of getting sidetracked? Because I know that's for me, that's one of the things that will happen is I'll get sidetracked because I find something so fascinating. And then I have to reel myself back out to be able to continue writing or doing whatever I'm trying to do in the first place.
Yeah. Oh, I've been down a few rabbit holes. It's getting back out, I think, is the is the key. So when I started, I knew very little about Chinese history in general, and specifically this early 20th century of China.
Mm,
And one of the comments that I've had from a lot of readers is they'll say, "Oh, I didn't know anything about the Chinese-Japanese War or the Chinese Civil War. All I know is that China is communist." I mean that and a lot, and often what follows, so people will then say something like, "And I'm so ashamed that I don't know more." And or I mean, you didn't say that. I'm glad you didn't, because I think it's just not that well known for a variety of reasons. I think China itself, when it became quite closed, didn't really want to talk about that history
yeah.
for a variety of reasons. And it was only really recently, in the past 5 or 10 years, even 15 maybe, the stories of that generation, meaning my father and my grandmother, so those two generations, have been reaching the surface more in scholarship and in English, and in English speaking scholarship. I don't know about Asian scholarship, but I think, um, and I think there's almost a sense that many people wanted to just leave all that sadness behind and not tell those stories. And then there was a realization, this generation is dying and we need to know their stories.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the research that I found was dated from, early 2010s and forward. Scholarship, maybe 2005, 2006 might have been some of the earliest stuff. But scholarship, people interviewing families who had been in Taiwan, or been China, Taiwan to the US. I found some memoirs, a couple of key memoirs and autobiographies. I found a wonderful set of oral histories that I think only came out in 2019, collected by a researcher in, I think she's in California, named Danke Li, about the city of Chongqing. So those are stories, I'm not really focused that too much on, communist China versus nationalist China. That plays a role in the book.
Yeah.
The heart of my research was really China before the Chinese Civil War. So I have a lot of academic scholars to thank.
That's awesome. And I think it's interesting because like you were saying how as a society we're realizing that generation is passing away. And without them telling us our stories, we don't know what happened in certain periods of time because there aren't a lot of like texts that tell us because a lot of people just kind of wanted to not deal with it, wanted to swipe it under the door, if that makes sense, just to kind of step away, disassociate, and move on. And that was one of the things I found very interesting when the name changes to Henry and he's in America. And that was something that it was interesting to see the battle between nationalist and communist China and how he never really knew what side he belonged on. And because of that, it kept him away from the Chinese community in his hometown in America because he was worried that something would happen to his family back home. And that was interesting that you kind of put that in to show that things did and do happen.
Yeah, and in fact, a few different readers of the book. One in particular said, she said, "Oh yeah, my parents knew about the spies as well." I mean, I don't specifically say these are spies for the nationalist, in the nationalist KMT Kuomintang back in Taiwan. I don't say that outright, but someone else's. Yeah, we knew about them. So, and kind of on that note, I think some of the research also came from, I just lucked into some people telling personal stories. The internet is amazing, and you just find people, and then if they'll talk, those who will talk really will talk a lot. And yeah.
What I think is a lot, especially with that generation, Oh, I think a lot of people collectively don't really ask them questions about their history. And so when someone finally does, it's like the floodgates are open. They will tell you anything and everything.
Yeah. And I think that that's been another realization for me, that like collectively people don't talk about that. I thought that was only my dad. And so then I had my character Lily thinking it was just her. And even all the way up to publishing this book, I was still thinking I'm still going to be an outlier in the Chinese diaspora as someone who doesn't speak the language well and doesn't know my parents' story. When you feel like you're an outlier, you think, well, certainly someone who's both their parents are Chinese, they'll know all the stories. And I've been surprised by the number of second generation or mixed race Chinese who will say, I didn't know anything either. And I don't speak the language either. And I feel a little less alone, I would say. Not alone, I was going to say a little less culpable, but maybe, I mean, it's no one's fault, but it is interesting that it's, maybe that's the thing in writing. You think it's maybe your own view, but there are others who have a similar experience or
Yeah.
can speak to it anyway.
And it's amazing to see because I think, especially from an author standpoint, you're writing a book that's very personal to you. And so you don't know how it will interact with everyone else, if anyone else has had the similar story, and to what extent. And because there's another book that I read last year that talked a lot about being a first generation in America and the difficulties he had, especially with his parents and everything in relation to that. And it was interesting because even though it wasn't I'm drawing a blank on the title, but I know it wasn't about someone that was Mexican immigrating. It was a different culture, but I was able to kind of look at my grandparents on my dad's side because my abuelito and abuelita are from Guadalajara, Mexico. And so I was able to kind of look at what they went through and what my father went through being the first generation being born in America and with this book. And it really just, it's very interesting because it makes you, in my opinion, it makes you crave to learn more. And it makes you want to know about your own family's history. And then you don't realize a lot of times that you don't know everything and that you haven't heard these stories until you read it in a book or you talk to someone and they're sharing things that you had no idea that happened that your family might have gone through.
Yeah, well, that's really, really beautiful. The fact that I hope, can hope for from the book. Sometimes people say, what do you hope your book, does, or, and it seems like such a massive question. But I think one of the things that I've heard people say, which feels like amazing, is how they say, well, this has made me want to ask my parents questions, or this has inspired some conversations between me and my own parents. And it's often from families where there is a migration experience. It doesn't need to be simply a particular diaspora, and it even can be, just families. It can even be beyond that. I mean, there's something about family stories that makes me think we're more alike than we are different, and not in a really in a very deep way. There are the differences to celebrate because they're quite colorful and fun. But I think most people know what it is to love, or to be just betrayed, or to really misunderstand someone and want to understand someone.
Yeah, and I think at the root of it all, we're all human.
Yeah.
And so we all have similar connections and similar, even though they're expressed differently or we have different cultures, so we celebrate things differently, but we still have that underlying connection to everyone.
Yeah, and wanting to understand that connection in whatever way I think is a real hunger.
Yeah. Okay, so I had one other question because I know the scroll played a large part in this book, and Peach Blossom Spring is one of the stories that was on the scroll. And so that was originally how did you get, because I know with the short story, was that originally going to be something in the short story that you had that you were using, or did that come into effect when you started writing the book as a whole?
The scroll came later.
Okay.
And so that wasn't at all a part of the short story. There was another sort of inciting incident, I guess you could call it, in my own life. And I should get the notebook out to find out when this was. But I was at the British Museum in London looking at their scrolls, and they had a particular one on display. There's a great digitization of this one. It's called the Admonitions Scroll. And that's a short name for Admonitions to the Ladies of the Court from the Empress. And it's supposed to be pictures of how ladies should behave towards men and the emperor. And that was the first time I really had stopped and looked at a hand scroll. And I was really fascinated by it. It was beautiful. One of the things about it, though, was the copy at the British Museum, the first 3 scenes are missing. They know they're missing because it's been quite fragmented, and it's had a lot of repair. But there's a version of it in the Palace Museum in Beijing, and there are 3 scenes that the British Museum says, oh, well, those aren't real, they are guessed at, they aren't part of the original. So, but this idea, the first 3 scenes are missing, just like, I saw that, I thought, that's like my dad's life, I don't know the first 3 scenes. So I got interested in hand scrolls, and I honestly don't know when it slipped into the story. One of the few facts I do know about my dad's family is that they did have an antique store and a kerosene shop, which is sort of the set at the beginning of the story. And he did make a comment at one time that they had some scrolls. But I don't know when it somehow it was just there, and the character Merlin was carrying it, and I knew it was going to be very important. So
that makes sense. I think it's interesting how things kind of will come into in existence into the story, into the novel, and you just don't really know when they got added. They just kind of appeared, and they just became, especially because that's such a huge part of the book, because it's so intertwined throughout the entire story, and that in itself is a story. And so I think that's interesting how it just appeared. And I feel like it's very fitting.
Yeah. People often ask about that question, and maybe I should look at my old notebooks and kind of like, they're all over there on the shelf. I sort of don't have the heart to open them up, but maybe in a few months it'll be interesting.
Yeah, when you write the short story.
The novellas you're asking about, yeah.
Yeah, the other one I was curious too is, Renshu, he changes his name to Henry, because I know the original short story title had Henry's name in it. So what kind of made you decide that that was going to be his name?
A little bit of a funny story. So that's not my father's name, but there was somebody in our town who thought that was his name. And I grew up in a small town where everybody knows everybody, and lived there for 20 years, and this person always called him Henry, and so it's just a little bit of a joke. And then when my dad kind of got to the point where he was on the internet, and he set up a fake, well, not a fake, but an email address, he called himself Henry. So that was
That's awesome. But I think you just kind of don't correct the person, and then you can't at the end of the day because it's been so long.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So not only was the character inspired by your father, but also in a way his name as well. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about specifically when Renshu becomes Henry. It almost seems like they're separate characters, even though they're the same person. And because he disassociates what happened in his past, he kind of puts on this new personality in a way, and it's a little bit different and separate from Renshu. And so how were you able to translate that, not only with the name, but also with the character and the development and the different personalities, even though they're the same person?
Yeah, I mean, I think I very deliberately wanted to make this break between when he was, Dao Renshu, and when he became Henry Dao.
Yeah.
And so, and I think, at first in the character's mind, I think he's thinking, well, this is just a name. I'm just taking on this name, Henry. It'll make things easier. But the longer that he's in America, and the longer that he's there without seeing his mother, and the farther away Taiwan gets, it's hard to hang on to that, really hard to hang on to that old identity. And I think he has to make some kind of peace with deciding it's hard to live with one foot in both worlds. And I remember my dad saying that to me at one point when I was quite young. I think he said, oh, it's hard to try to live in 2 places at once. I mean, in one of those sort of rare moments of candor, he said that. So yeah, the character of Henry is he's meant to be infuriating. He is meant to be, it's meant to be jarring that he's so different from that young boy. But I think it's a protective device, because when he looks back at China and Taiwan, there's so much helplessness on the one hand, there's so much sadness, and there's this huge, it's like almost survivor's guilt. You know, his mother is in Taiwan.
Yeah.
Much of the family has been lost. He's there in America. He's meant to do the best he can for everyone. So there's that pressure. And being a character and a person who doesn't necessarily speak a lot, I think his mother was such a good mother, maybe almost too good of a mother. He doesn't have the best resilience muscles because she was always kind of swooping in and saving him.
Yeah. She hid that a lot from him too, what she went through.
Yeah, she held back quite a lot. I don't know that he had the emotional or psychic intelligence to navigate holding who he was then with who he needed to be in America. So he just needed to let go.
Yeah, and I think it's done in a very interesting way, a beautiful way. The way it's described, the way it's shown and portrayed, not only in the character, but the story writing on how he kind of makes this transition, and he becomes almost very sheltered when he moves to America. He doesn't really want to talk to people. He doesn't want to go out and do things because he has the fear of the past essentially coming back to haunt him. And so that was very interesting, the way that kind of kept resurfacing throughout the rest of the novel, and how he still had this underlying fear and underlying worry about that. And that's kind of why he just disassociated, and he just wanted to be this new person, even though in his mind it's the same person.
Yeah, I think he doesn't consciously realize how much he's changed. And I also wanted to kind of suggest that some of the same tactics and instincts that kept them safe and alive in war-torn China were the same instincts and tactics that kind of crumpled in on himself in what felt like a peaceful America, although it was Cold War, so it was a different kind of war. But it's sort of it's the same instincts kicking in, but they don't work in the same way in these situations.
Yeah, it's an entirely different setting, an entirely different place that he's in. They're not having to run from place to place, and so he has the ability to kind of move on from that, and instead I feel like it becomes his coping mechanism. Everything that he learned from his mom, he just wants to keep that with him, which is kind of beautiful in a way, because it's still keeping his mom alive in his memory and with him.
Yeah, just thinking about him, it's quite refreshing to talk a little bit more about Henry. You find I don't know if you're a writer yourself, but do you write?
I do, yeah.
Oh, great. You might find that people will concentrate on different parts of what you've written, and a lot of my conversations so far have been maybe about Mei-Lin, about Lily, so it's really nice in a way to talk more about Henry. And yeah, so I appreciate the questions. That's why for some of these I'm just like, ooh, good point.
Yeah, well,
I'll think about that for a few months now.
I thought it'd be nice to talk a little bit more about Henry, only because that's originally where the story started.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting how it started with that and then it went back. And so how you were able to tie it together, and everything I've seen, yeah. So it's been nice to chat about both, but especially with Henry and how that developed. I know obviously you're an author and you write novels, but do you read novels, and what genres of books do you read typically?
I love reading. I think I'm a reader before I'm a writer. And I read novels, I read lots, kind of whatever just sort of demands my attention when I go into a bookstore. I kind of like going in without an agenda. And even more so since writing my book, I think I like picking up a book and just consciously deciding I'm going to read it on its own terms. So I'm not going to demand that it has to have this type of character development or this kind of plot, or this sort of beautiful language. I'm just going to read it for what it is. So so I like most, I will give a good try to most everything. I mean, I think if I finish a book, I'll find something I like about it. I don't know too much. That being said, I haven't read too much, say, like fantasy, sci-fi. I think those are areas where I think I will explore those. I've read a little more. I read some thrillers lately because of other debut authors. So this is all a way of saying I think I used to be a genre snob, and I've realized that that's a waste of time and you miss out. If you say, I'm not going to read X kind of book, then okay, fine. There's lots of books in the world, but you're cheating yourself.
You really do.
Because there's interesting things. So
Say there's so many
now,
beautiful novels in
oh, go
every
ahead.
genre. And so when you stick to one genre, you're missing out on all of those other books because that might be your next favorite book and you just won't go to it because it's not the genre you typically read.
Yeah, so it's that sort of just pick up a book and don't. The covers are really fun. Cover art is amazing, but don't worry too much about it. Maybe read the first page, read a little bit, and if it grabs you, yeah. So a book I just finished is called, and I know it's out in the US. Do I have my copy? Yeah, it's really good. So it's called When We Were Birds.
I have not read it, but it is on I actually own that book. Just haven't had the chance to read it yet.
Well, when you do, you're in for a treat. Her voice is just incredible. I think what she does with language. So, and actually, our two books, I was just on a panel with her over the weekend, and to read them and comparing is very, very interesting because this book is very rooted. There's sort of two scenes, two places, really. There's a graveyard and a house in a fictional city in Trinidad. And, mine is sort of all over the place and lots of houses and lots of cities. But given that, just thinking about ancestors and heritage and what it is to have too much of a heritage or what if it compared with having what feels like no heritage, they're really a rich conversation can be had between these two books. And yeah, this one made me cry. I haven't had a book made me. I was crying on the train, and there was another point where I know we're supposed to be talking about my book, but this one, Ayana Lloyd Banwell, I should say, When We Were Birds for the podcast. Maybe Ayana could come on your podcast.
That would be wonderful. I need to add it. I need to move it up. My problem is I have so many books on my to be read pile. And it's hard to prioritize because, like you were saying, when you go into a book, and sometimes a book, it needs to be read on its own terms, and it calls to you, and that's the one that you have to pick up. And that was actually my experience with Peach Blossom Spring,
Oh,
because I have so many books on my TBR, I am drowning in it basically, and I recently have gotten into all different genres. So growing up, I grew up mostly with science fiction, but specifically dystopian science fiction. It's like The Hunger Games, Divergent, Maze Runner, all of those.
yeah.
And that's just kind of what I grew up with. I didn't really grow up with fantasy, but in my brain, it was, oh, it's science fiction fantasy. And so recently I've gotten into fantasy, but in the past 2 years or so, I've really kind of broadened my horizons on what I read. And I've gotten a lot of interesting historical fiction novels, and I've kind of gone down this path of I've been reading a lot more historical fiction, and I happened to get the audio version of Peach Blossom Spring, and I was like, oh, I probably won't get to this for a while. And then I woke up the next day and I was like, I feel like it's time. I feel like I need to read this book. I know I just added this to my TBR and everything else has been here for years, but I feel like it's calling to me. And it was perfect timing. I think I finished it in like 2 days. And so it was a wonderful experience.
Oh, that's amazing. That's so amazing to hear. And I think we have to read the books at the right time, like for each of us. And
Yeah.
I think books will be patient and or when you get to them, because there's nothing better than feeling like you're reading a book that is just the book you need to be reading at a time.
Yeah.
And it also kind of on the flip side of that, it can also feel kind of bad to be reading a book feeling like slightly resenting it, like I'm trying to get through this book because of I need to and then you just like, so I've read a lot this year trying to get through a lot of fellow debut novels. And I've enjoyed that a lot, but I'm conscious that that the experience isn't the same as when you just somehow the right book lands in your hands at the right time, and it's speaking to you, and that's the most amazing thing.
It really is. That was the other thing because I know your book recently came out. It came out this past March, which is only 2 months ago. How was your experience? Because I know you were able to do in-person events, which was really amazing. And I know, especially, I don't want to say towards the end of the pandemic because it's still here, but not having your book come out in the height of the pandemic, because I know a lot of authors were not able to do in-person events. And so that was interesting to kind of see. How did that play a role at all with when your book was going to be published, as far as the timing? Because I know there were a lot of pushbacks, and then also being able to do the in-person events.
So I think that there were some books that they did hold, as you say. Mine, that was not the case. So let's see it. The manuscript sold in about March 2020, and then the next day the world, as we knew it, ended. And then, and a lot of the pandemic I spent revising it, but it was always going to be a 2022 release. So initially they said January, and then I think some very smart marketing person said, you need to release this book in the spring because of the title. And so they shifted it. And so that was pretty much to schedule. It's been such a delight to do in-person events. And I do feel really lucky because I know, several authors who, there are a lot of really, really difficult things about the pandemic for everyone around the world. So, and these authors would say, it's a small thing to say, I'm really sad I didn't get my book launched, but it really was sad. And I understand that because, you kind of dream of not only holding your book, but getting to meet people who have read it or want to read it. And just that moment of eye contact.
Yeah.
And that feeling of, oh goodness, these people, they're interested. So yeah, I think I just feel really, really happy that I got to do some. I've got one last one on the schedule at the moment, one last live one, and then. So.
Is it in London?
It's at Hay.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so that's a great note to end on. This weekend I was in Norwich, and that was wonderful because a lot of this book I wrote at Norwich, and there are some friends there that I hadn't seen since the pandemic or even before, and that just felt like a huge homecoming. So I was just on this absolute high from the weekend of, just I felt like I was bringing my book to meet its home.
That's awesome. Did writing in that specific place have any inspiration into the story at all, as far as like the interactions you had there or anything?
So yeah, I would say very much. I was there on a fellowship, and I had while I was there, I had a mentor who I met with about once a month, and my determination when I started this year-long fellowship was, I thought, this is a golden opportunity to basically write for a year. So I have to leave with a decent draft. It has. So when I met with my mentor, after the first meeting, I thought to myself, I'm not going to bring back anything that he's seen before, because we could go back and forth on the first chapter for the entire year. So I thought, I'm always going to bring him something new. And I just kept jumping and kept jumping. And and a lot of times I would jump several years and just give him a section. And then he would ask a question about, oh, well, did such and such happen before to set this up? And I'd say, oh, maybe. And then I think, oh, got to put that in. Or then he'd have questions about what might happen next. So it was really great. It was kind of like by doing this leapfrogging, if I leapfrog from 1950 to 1964, he might have questions about 1955. Then I could go fill that in and then have questions about 1970, so it helped keep me going. There's a lot of momentum. So, and I think just the kind of space in my head, even though Norwich is not at all 20th century China, in my mind, when I'm in Norwich, I'm sort of in early 20th century China, thinking about the characters. And
Nice.
yeah,
That's awesome.
so
And then the last thing I wanted to ask is because I know we kind of already talked about like the book you're reading currently with When We Were Birds, but are there any other books that just really spoke to you or like some of your favorites, whether it's what got you into reading or just recent favorites?
ooh, how about a book that got me into writing?
Oh, okay.
I was, because one just popped in my head, was Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird. Do you know that book?
I don't think I do.
It's about writing, and it's an older book. I think it came out 1997, I think is when I remember. Because yeah, first coming across it. And it's just about, she's hilarious for one thing. But the sort of instructions on how to write. They give you a lot of permission to write badly and show up and keep going. And yeah, and that title Bird by Bird is a little bit of a hint, like, you just do everything. Not, I'm sure it's not a coincidence that it rhymes with word by word. So yeah, I go back to that book, and it always makes me laugh, and it cheers me up and gets me writing again. So
Yeah. And I think that's true because that's with me. I don't have anything published, but I do enjoy writing. And that's one of the things that I try to do is just write every day because you can only sharpen your tools by writing every day, even if it's I've even seen where people say, like, just write down a conversation you hear, as long as it's something. And then eventually you can refine the tools to where you're able to write more of a story.
yeah, I agree with that 100%. Just show up, write, and yeah, and like you say, if you have to just steal someone else's conversation from the cafe, that
Yeah.
counts.
Yeah. Because I think too, because when you do that, you, at least depending on how you write it, you have to describe, like if you describe what's happening and it helps you, at least for me, one of the things I have a difficult time balancing with over describing and under describing a scene. And so having the conversation be going, but still explaining what's happening around them and the mood that there is and what other people might be thinking or their facial expressions, and not just writing about that, but also keeping the focus on the conversation that's happening. And so I think that's kind of a fun exercise to do.
Yeah, it's a lot of plates to spin, and every single one has something important on it. Yeah, so yeah,
Yeah.
great.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. It was such a delight and a wonderful pleasure to be able to interview you and talk with you about Peach Blossom Spring.
Yeah, oh, thank you. It was my pleasure entirely, and good luck with your reading and writing and podcast. I think writers and readers everywhere, thank you for your services to literature.
Do you have anything that is set to come out within the next couple of years that has already been sold? Or are you currently working on something that you will be trying to get published that you can say?
I have an idea, and I told my idea to my agent, and she liked it, and we told it to my publishers, and they like it. But it's not been sold, it's not been written, so I've got some work to do. But
Okay.
I do want to write another book, so that's my
Great. Well, I will greatly anticipate that book.
great. I'll let you know. I'll keep you in the loop.
Sounds good.
Thanks a lot, Joshua.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining. It was really wonderful to chat with you and just talk about your book. Your book is just absolutely amazing. So, and thank you for writing it.
You're welcome. Thank you. Yeah, it's been great.
I don't know about you listening, but I had such a wonderful time today talking with Melissa Fu. And if you are interested in reading Peach Blossom Spring, it is out everywhere to my knowledge. You can buy it anywhere books are sold. Specifically, if you can support independent bookstores, I am sure that there is one, if not close to you, then one that can ship to you. Come back next week for another podcast episode where I'll be interviewing yet another author. And of course, you don't have to, but if you want to subscribe or give me feedback, I would greatly appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and happy reading.